Hello and welcome to the Barcast. I'm your host, Nick Barr, coming to you on a Tuesday winter morning here in New York. I am recovering from flu, so apologies for the somewhat impaired voice. Let's read the sexual one, whose keyword is vehemence or zeal. This is Naranjo introducing the chapter. Oscar Ichazo used the Spanish word celo in reference to the characteristic passion of the sexual instinct, a word with a dual meaning. When referring to an animal en celo, in heat that is, in estrus, the word denotes great sexual excitement. In the context of personality, when one does something con celo, it implies care, dedication, or fervor. Thus, it can be understood that celo, in its broadest sense, is analogous to the intensity with which an animal in heat seeks the object of its instinct. We could say that a sexual type is characterized by a special intensity in their desires, making them urgent and vehement. To understand why anger in the sexual sphere results in this celo, we can say that anger amplifies desire by infusing it with aggressiveness. In other words, anger gives any desire a special force and intensity, leading the person to feel not only strongly drawn to its satisfaction, but also to feel entitled to it. The result is a type characterized by a strong spirit of dominance and conquest. I'm going to kind of breeze through some of this, but he describes sort of the entitlement of the Spanish conquistadores, or the entitlement of the South Africans, or the Europeans exploiting the mines in South Africa. And he recounts quite a graphic story of the sexual entitlement of a 6-year-old boy with his sister that I'm not going to repeat here. But this feeling of essentially feeling entitled to pursue one's desires. And he concludes, because we live in a sufficiently repressive culture, it is usual for children to experience shame and sometimes even guilt that leaves traumatic traces when reprimanded by their parents for sexual activities. For a sexual type, however, especially the sexual one, the force of the impulse is sufficient to make the person, just as happens in the case of the lustful type, more willing to question the censorship of authority than the strength of their desires. So, and we'll read the account by Isabel Herrera in a second, but I think we want to do a little bit more framing here. So we're in the doing triad, we're in the passion of anger, which is the one, and the sexual one feels that frustration, that friction, the gap between how things should be and how things are, and they seek to close that gap. And they feel bodily zeal, zest, vehemence toward that results in really powerful trust of their instincts, a sort of justification through the instincts. And so here I think we want to spend a little bit of time making sure that we're properly disambiguating the sexual one from the 8, right? Because the 8 has passion, right? Lust. So how do we differentiate between the 8 and the 1? Let's hold that question as we read the chapter. This is Isabel Herrera. I will start by saying that I'm the first surprised by everything that my self-knowledge process is bringing me. I start from a total ignorance or lack of expectation of where I'm going in this transformation. In summary, I would say that by observing myself in my categorological mask, everything else comes. Today I can say that I feel serene with myself and with the world. Although I am considered generous, I have always been selective in showing my generosity to others, both materially and emotionally, although this generosity was rather driven or directed from the body. I mean that I had no pattern to sustain it, but rather generosity occurred if my body intuitive impulse led me to it or not. With children, the elderly, people with some type of disability, animals, and plants, I've always felt available and generous. It is like protecting the lives of the most vulnerable. Now my emotional life is more attentive and less demanding, more tender and warm explicitly, as before it only occurred in the intimacy of my home and in friendship. The recognition of the freedom of the other continues, as well as the appreciation of my own freedom, which is not detachment, but respect for one's own space and time, as well as for the needs of the other, without making them mine. In material terms, the most significant change is giving myself more time for myself and my needs, being less attentive to the needs of others, as I tended to take care of others, sometimes forgetting my own needs. On the other hand, my desires have been reduced to almost nothing. It is like discovering that I need less and less to live, and from that simplicity, living with more serenity and harmony with myself and my surroundings. With less need also comes less self-demand and demand toward others. I have even more to share and give away, almost as if I could live off the air. Before, my generosity consisted of giving to whom I thought needed and what I thought I could give. I was empathetic, although my empathy was filtered through ideology. Now I am more spontaneous and feel more compassionate, more lived with what happens in the moment. So we can pause here. I don't think this chapter doesn't have sections, so we're just going to have to kind of like power through it. So already we're getting pretty good disambiguation between the 1 and the 8 here, right? As well as some overlap. So Herrera points out that she's drawn to the vulnerable, and that the 8 would have the same experience of being particularly drawn to protecting the lives of the most vulnerable. But the 1 is much more generous and much more other-centered than the 8. And I'm really focusing on the sexual one. The other subtypes of the 1 are much easier to differentiate from the 8. But I love what she says here. She says, before, my generosity consisted of giving to whom I thought needed and what I thought I could give. I was empathetic, although my empathy was filtered through ideology. It's almost a little bit of like a Robin Hood energy there. An innate desire to give and generosity, but not a spontaneous generosity. Instead, a generosity that's processed through morality or moralism. And that's so key for the 1, is there's always ideology. There's always a moralism and a morality, whereas the 8 is absolutely a kind of winner take all, kill or be killed, every dog eat dog, however you like it. The conflict is such a core part of the 8's worldview in a way that's not coming up here. So while we're talking about vehemence and zeal and an entitlement to get what one wants, for the sexual one, what one wants oftentimes is goodness, empathy, a feeling of justice, a felt sense of justice. And already the word serenity is coming up over and over again here. And serenity is the redemption of the 1. If you use that language, the 1 moves from anger to serenity. When the 1 puts down the sword, realizing that they don't have to fight everything. She continues, when I was 18 years old, I told a friend, I like who I am, but I lack serenity. I like who I am. Yeah, the sexual 1 likes who they are. They would have to if they're going to follow their bodily desires. I also intuited quite clearly that I would find some of it with age. A clear sensation that I feel in my body, and more specifically my belly, is that of a fiery impulse that seeks an outlet, that wants to expand outward, and does so also through my feet and hands. I feel great vitality that has 2 faces, depending on the circumstance. 1, playful, expressed through sports, dance, erotic or sexual sensuality, play, etc. Excuse me. The other, aggressive anger, especially when I feel that something or someone is crossing my boundaries or may somehow threaten my integrity. It is short-lived and very intense. It is like baring my teeth and marking the distance. A familiar image to me in felines, my favorite animals. This anger occurred on few occasions, but it was overwhelming. Hurtful words could come out of my mouth that could make others feel like shit. Then it would pass, I would apologize, and the discussion could continue normally. And we could even make peace despite the agreement. The lack of serenity has to do with that fiery impulse, with feeling that anger would carry me away, that I couldn't control it, and with realizing how I could swing from one extreme to the other in a short time. This also disconcerted and disoriented the people around me, and I felt how it hurt them, which also made me suffer. The saving grace was it didn't last too long. In SAT 2, I discovered that when I was born, I fell in love with the world, the light, life, but my father's rejection for not being a boy and the abuse and anger with him made me distrust people, though not life. Finding the key to this understanding led me to the harmony that comes from trusting life and people. Serenity now comes from having conquered my guts, my insides, or belly, and letting myself be carried by trust, from not feeling my two extremes so polarized, although I know where and how to visit them since they're very familiar and still live in my body. I no longer strive to push the river. I simply recognize that I wouldn't have wanted to live any life other than mine. Attention to that second before automatism gives me the freedom to choose. I feel free. It's the freedom to choose that comes along with serenity, right? Is this a battle that I want to fight? Before, my way of thinking was to want to do everything as well as possible, demanding from myself and others. So that's a great articulation of the sexual one. I want to do everything as well as possible, demanding from myself and others. So contrast that to the social one who we covered, who has superiority, who's sort of boundaried in their perfectionism. The sexual one lacks those boundaries. Right? They demand the best from them, they demand the best from others. They're pushy in a way. When it wasn't like that, the ease of criticism or angry outbursts was the order of the day. I thought that the injustices in the world could be solved if everyone did their part. That's essential sexual one and would resonate with a one in general in a way that the 8, it's a bizarre version of the 8. The 8 is almost like the mirror of that. The injustices in the world could be solved. The 8 is almost like the world is unjust, so everyone should do their own thing. So they're quite different, even though they share some energy. Therefore, when I encountered a flagrant injustice, my aggression would automatically jump out. I had the fantasy that I could improve the world. Ones are reformers, and maybe I can do something, but not in such an aggressive way. She's continuing. She leaves more space for her emotions, those that in childhood I was taught not to show because they were considered a sign of weakness, sadness, vulnerability, pain. This feeling, pain, is the one that still costs me the most to show publicly. But now, when it appears, I let it be before anyone. The paradox is that my impulsive reactions have considerably reduced, so my moods and emotions are more balanced, have fewer oscillations, and are less intense than in the past. I would say that by lowering the intensity of the sexual instinctive sphere, the other two instincts have been balancing, especially the conservative one. And in passing, I've connected more with the emotional. I could describe my sensation as if the strong potential energy of the hara had risen to the heart, impregnating all this other spheres with the heart tenderness that I know I have. The relationship with my father and 8 was an authentic battle. I felt a need to confront him about everything. On the other hand, with my mother and siblings, I developed a more protective bond to defend them from an abusive father and husband. My mother, a 3, I didn't consider much because I negatively judged her passivity in living through others. And Naranjo shares that in his introduction, the one has strong father energy or father love, that authoritative, empathic. The father love is, I guess, sort of admiring love. Regardless, it's like God, Father, whatever you want to call it, there's sort of an authority, an interior authority figure saying it should be this way. A strong superego, if you want to use Freudian language, like ideology, moralism, should language. But the one has that should language so intertwined with their bodily instinct in a really kind of wonderful way. Let's continue. In meditation, the need for solitude and silence arose. That's where I still am. In that solitude, I've never felt alone or depressed. On the contrary, I feel more part of the world and humanity than ever. So meditation's been a great help to her. Inner silence. From that stillness, my being in the world is more solid and firm. I have lost desire, both sexual and for other things. And it has surprised me as a woman not even to feel desire to feel desired. I remember that Claudio once said that to leave something behind, you have to have experienced or lived it first, and that's what I've done. I've lived my sexuality intensely and playfully, and I've reached a great peace. The more demanding and judgmental paternal energy no longer pushes. It has been replaced by admiring and devotional love, initially represented in Claudio, and then expanded towards the mystery that sustains us all and everything, toward the divine and sacred in each of us and in nature as an expression of sublime beauty. This gives the respect I feel for life and all things a deeper and more subtle connotation. I went from fighting and rejecting a God who resembled my father to feeling part of that divinity. The filial energy is expressed in a less erotic, sexual, and more sensual way. It's more connected with all senses. So this is a Naranjo 3 kind of love thing that comes up from time to time. So there's the paternal, admiring love or devotional love, filial or sexual or erotic love, which she describes less as sexual and more sensual. And then the maternal love, I relate to the bond with the earth and the body. My friends have surprised me by defining me as joyful, generous, warm, tender person, not resentful, and with a lot of humor. Before, in my personal relationships, men predominated, and for about 10 years now, women predominate. In general, I feel very close to them, and there is a bond of cooperation, complicity, and sisterhood. Lately, I relate a lot with 4 women, type 4 women, whom I've been able to support without judging or demanding, and they have been able to lean on me. There are also some 9 and even a few sexual 1s who feel good and comfortable with me, and I feel with them. So she comes back to distrust being related to people. She trusts life, but not people. I think when she's talking about trusting life, she's saying I relate it to nature and animals, but it's also life, the life force, life energy, body, instinct. I have felt little guilt. So it's so interesting. I mean, the 1 subtypes are very important, clearly, to understand, because guilt is crippling for some ones. But it seems like the sexual 1 type is sort of, there's a shameless quality or a guilt-free quality. They profoundly trust their instinct as their instinct as the vessel or the vehicle through which they bring more justice into the world. The trait of worry is not familiar to me. I've heard it applied to the 1, but I don't feel it is mine. Let me explain. From the age of 8 to 16, I did competitive gymnastics, then risk sports like high mountain climbing, caving, diving, etc. Focus was on the here and the now and breathing, which was very natural for me. Perhaps that is why I trusted the body impulse. letting myself be carried by what the body advised at the moment. Taking a step, not staying stuck, ruminating on where to go, was always my way of doing things. I would say that the step itself marks the direction towards a goal, even if I don't know what it is. Really just noticing the lack of interiority for the body triad, the doing triad, the gut triad. And I don't mean that as a negative thing. It's striking as a 4, who's sort of one of the more interior types. Like worry, guilt, not familiar to her. Just sort of focusing on breathing, on doing, on being in the body, on taking action. Sometimes my experience has been to seek a solution to a problem in the following way. I want to get my husband out of jail, where he is for political reasons. I know what the goal is, and I make the path as I walk. I involve all the people, organizations, and institutions that can do something. I don't care if they're not of the same ideology. If I have to visit the Attorney General of the National Court in Madrid or the Minister of Justice of the country, I do it. And if in the same effort others can benefit, then a list is made with all of them. And it worked. Of the 6 involved, all received some type of pardon, my husband the most. Along the way, I took steps that did not prosper, and there were others who wanted to take the credit, but that did not discourage me or make me dwell on the same thing over and over again. In that aspect, the before and after have not varied much. However, that impulsiveness, the demand for things to come out and quickly, and the push as a result of the demand have softened. So what did she say about, it was such a clear, I'm trying to find it. Injustice, I think, I thought that the injustices in the world could be solved if everyone did their part. That for me feels like the before and after that doesn't change, right? Like the one has this reformer mindset that healthy one and unhealthy ones alike are going to be in social justice, in activism, in those kinds of capacities. But the relationship to that work is either going to result in burnout, exhaustion, conflict, right? And we see a lot of that in the social sector. Or that work can be done from a place of serenity without that pushing, urgent, hot quality. And that work is that inner work is so important for the social sector in general. How many people get burned out, are in conflict all the time over minutia? Gosh, like if the Enneagram found its way more into nonprofit work and activism work, it'd be so great, because there's a whole lot of 1s, 9s, and 2s in that space. Okay, let's carry on. Life before was to be lived, explored, and wanted all of us to live better with fewer injustices and inequalities, which is why I joined clandestine political activities against Francoism from a very young age. Before, the mystery was in death, what is beyond life. Today, life is that great mystery that penetrates us and we do not know, regardless of what science says, and I give myself to it, trying to explore some of its inscrutable paths that have brought me closer to the divine. Another important element of transformation has been the use of aggressiveness and the ability to confront in the task of helping others. The fact is that both are generally very repressed and confused. There's also in this character a great ability to move from one extreme to the other of the polarities, and that we can put into play in therapeutic work. Our strength and determination can be at the service of accompanying and containing, especially in therapeutic work with strong enneatypes like 8 or 6, or sexual 6 specifically. So let's take that slowly. I guess what she's describing is wielding her innate aggressiveness and confrontation in service, as opposed to where it starts out, which is to meet the needs of the body, which again, the body is a vessel for justice. So it's not the lust of the 8. It's this deeply trusted instinct to do what's right. But then transforming it and using it as sort of a device in service, including in service of holding, accompanying, being with, containing. In the process of transformation, the angry aggressiveness of the sexual one is transformed into determination with warmth, and also into acceptance, judgment and criticism into acceptance, control into awareness that controlling is an illusion, and this ends up generating a transformation of control into spontaneity, vehemence into serenity, zeal into love of heart, idealism into loving compassion. I have discovered a genuine, indomitable spirit that I believe is linked to what in a dream appeared to me as the spirit of the girl who, to survive, made a pact with the potential warrior in her to take her place in the world. So in her telling of it, that's a beautiful, I think about these pacts. That's a great word. These pacts that we make as very, very young children with energy. And so as a very young girl, she made a pact with the warrior in her. And the sexual one is a warrior. They'll fight and confront to make the world a better place for everybody. But the little girl who made that pact, what happens to her? This account doesn't talk about it so much, but what do we know of the one in general is that the one in general becomes an adult very early, and things like vulnerability and pain, which she does allude to, are not really okay for the one to need or to experience. Like the two, the one isn't familiar with allowing themselves to have needs that might be met by another person. And so instead there's a strong energy with the ones that can lead to conflict, can lead to burnout, and lead to self-abandonment. There's some tender person in there that isn't being considered. And so for her, for Isabella, it sounds like this transformation from aggressiveness into warmth, from judgment into acceptance, and so on. There's a softening there that I imagine, brought in other qualities of this young girl who made that original pact, including spontaneity and eroticism, which come up quite a bit in this. Another contribution we ones who can make who are dedicated to therapeutic help is to work from the body and the sensual, the senses, and eroticism. From self-knowledge, we can accompany the other in their self-exploration. I call it the eagle's gaze, or how the ability to see defects becomes the ability to capture significant moments in or for the links into relationships and interdependencies. It'd be comparable to be able to see the forest and the trees at the same time. It's interesting. I was just talking to someone about eagle gaze, eagle eyes. So the one has that. Now, how that feels erotic, I'm not so sure. But there is this perceptiveness that I can definitely contact there. And right, and so, but can you, or can the sexual one save that vision from error correction? It's so wired for error correction, fault finding, criticism, into something more sensual, going from the ability to see defects to the ability to capture significant moments. And I think we need to spend one more minute on the whole sexual thing. And again, typically with modern Enneagram, we don't say sexual as much as one-to-one, but there is still that intensity of experience. And I think this is probably true for a lot of the sexual types. They might be more sexual, but their spontaneity is compromised in some way. Their sexuality becomes sort of more of a means to an end, and so true spontaneity may be missing. And so when she talks about the sensual and real eroticism, I'm imagining that sort of discernment that quality of like compassionate, involved interest in what's going on, and reconnecting with that from where she starts as a sexual one of like conflict. I need to get my way, which is this is a form of sexual contact. This is a form of one-to-one interaction, but in its kind of automaticity, it lacks actual spontaneity or creativity. Today, I feel that benevolence is genuine when it appears. In reality, if they don't point it out to me, I don't even realize when it emerges. The sexual one has this wonderful quality of genuine benevolence that I think sort of has persisted through her journey. I do know that in me, both poles have integrated, confrontation and benevolence, which coexist side by side. Perfectionism has become everything is fine in me as it is, and that is a relief. Playing with my poles and taking them out for a walk, like someone takes the little devil out for a walk, makes me laugh and brings sparks to my eyes. The girl has not lost the desire to play or to see the wonder of the world. And you can hear the poles here in a few different ways, including the wings of the one, the 9 and the 2, right? So the sexual 9, this self-forgetting, but here she's harnessing it in a really beautiful way. She talks frequently about she sort of lives off the air, doesn't have needs. She's found ways to essentially not really need much, and if not forget the self, allow the self to sort of recede, or the ego to recede, you could say. And then the 2 is that benevolence, that loving quality. So, at their best, at their healthiest, ones are pulling in the non-ego of the 9 and the generosity of the 2, which is quite a wonderful combination. Let's see if we can wind this up. My voice is, I notice, kind of going. Oh, this is fun. So she does all this work. I didn't realize how much I had changed until the day during a weekend workshop, my ex-partner, who's a sexual 4, who seemed very angry because he couldn't reconnect with me, either by good or bad means, threw a jug of water on me. I saw everything as if in slow motion. I was sitting and looked at the empty wine bottle on the table in front of me. But my guts didn't even move. And I understood with all clarity that responding to him meant getting caught in his game, and I didn't do it. This vivid anecdote still impresses me now, as in another time I would have jumped at his throat or broken the bottle over his head. I'm impressed by the capacity of SAT to transform people, especially by generating contact with love. Other discoveries of the process consisted, for example, in realizing that my madness was thinking I was less crazy than others. Yeah, and so that's a thing that the one feels less crazy than others. The one thinks they've got a better handle on what's right than others. And it's tricky because in some ways I think that is true. Like the one is in more contact with morality than most other types. And so what is the crazy idea here? I think the crazy idea is using that as leverage to get anything done. It's the same with the 4. The 4 maybe thinks they're more in contact with truth or the real emotions than others. And in some ways they're more perceptive, or more empathetic, or not empathetic, but more emotionally connected. But what good would it possibly do you to like walk around as an authority in that? None. And I guess I'll just share a couple of things here. I think we're done with this. Yeah, let's see. So I'll just read the closing lines here. At this moment, I am savoring that the origin was not aggressiveness, but a determination to live and occupy my place in the world. The knowledge of the body at birth of its path to extinction. That upon coming into the world, the curious girl, the angry warrior, and the old woman with a sense of humor already came together. The girl, to survive, made a pact with the warrior who protects her, although sometimes she exceeds her functions. That my childhood was not sexualized but sensualized. I still have that sensitivity of the senses, especially in touch and skin. Sexuality was a sensualized way of channeling energy or vitality, of which there is a lot, in a playful way. And of course, gratitude without ceasing for what life brings me, which gives me a lot, and yet I need less and less to live. So that's her account. And I guess I'll just share a couple of personal connections with the sexual one. So the first is my own fourness moves to one quite a lot. And I think there's quite a lot of self-preservation one that we'll get to next. But with the sexual one, yeah, I think there's also a way that, particularly in my coaching work, there's sort of a holding there. You know, she was describing this strength, this vitality, and confidence. You know, a lot of confidence that the one has. The one trusts their body, and this is a way that the one and the four are similar. The one and the four both profoundly trust themselves in some ways. The four is an aesthetic trust, and the one is a moral trust. The four is an aesthetic perfectionism, and the one is a moral perfectionism. So they have a lot in common, and I think they're also subject, when in relationship to each other, to a lot of fireworks, as she described with her sexual four partner. Precisely because you can really get at each other's throats around criticism and fault finding, and they happen for different reasons, but they do happen. And so the one is very sensitive to criticism, and the four has their own sensitivity to criticism if it takes a slightly different shape. So I can connect to the sexual one, not so much from a moral. I don't think I take on the moral quality of the injustice, but that this is not right and something needs to change, and the urgency, the heat of that is very familiar to me. As well as the gift of sort of self-disappearing into a kind of warm, benevolent, holding strength, and a zeal or a vehemence that isn't so personal or possessive, but it's, maybe, in my case, maybe aesthetic or relational. I think the four can borrow a lot of that energy from the one. And then my daughter, who is four, is a sexual one for sure. And, it's been cool working with Enneagram, thinking, the question of like, when do you get it? She was born with like flaming red hair, and she was screaming like, ah! And we felt her sense of injustice so quickly, just the injustice. She would freak out when things, weren't sort of a certain way from very, very early age. So her zestiness and her vehemence, and she's a very embodied little girl who wants things her way, but feels just the feeling of injustice, I think, is the easiest way for me to relate to the sexual one's energy. So while I like vehemence and zeal as keywords, injustice could be quite a nice one too, because injustice just gives you that sense of, it doesn't sit in your body. Where does injustice sit? It says not right. And that doesn't sit well with you. You know, when people talk about things not sitting well, you're talking about the gut. You're talking about the body. And something has to be done about it. And so the sexual one becomes this crusader of fixing injustices, but then also sees injustice everywhere. And so that urgency becomes important. And then the one also, the sexual one, I think, things get dicey when the sexual one wants things that are not just, right? When they maybe want their own pleasure, for instance. Because the body, because sensual desire and justice have been so fused, then I think the work is to experience justice without sensual desire, i.e. aggressiveness, and also access sexuality without justice. You know, pleasure for pleasure's sake, maybe work for the one to access. And you know, that's what she's talking about when she's talking about her spontaneity, her eroticism, all of that. And then the playfulness. You know, my daughter is so playful and silly, and I think of that as the 9 coming in too. But it's such kind of a relief anytime she can just play and be goofy, and we love when she's a goofball, because I think that's the eroticism without the justice. It's just like play for play's sake. It's splashing in the pool. It's making a mess. It's that kind of free-spirited play that we kind of like feed that. We really love seeing that when she accesses it, because I think if one doesn't know the Enneagram, or if one doesn't do this work, the sexual one could easily start to reject those parts of themselves, because that's sort of zeal without linked to the justice quality. So we see those as sort of like replenishing, nourishing moments. So I just wanted to share a little bit about, you know, kind of practical applications of the Enneagram with this subtype that I know well and love very much. Okay, we will finish the one next time with the